All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be continuing along the path of Final Fantasy classes by looking at a class that I've actually been leveling for a little bit now in Final Fantasy XIV, the Machinist. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon and turn notifications on. All of those things are really, really important. I say this in every video because it literally is extremely important. And the videos that get more likes and have more comments on them, more people see them. That's just how it works. So yes, please do all of those things. So, the Machinist is interesting, to say the least. First things first, the Machinist quote-unquote class is kind of unique to Final Fantasy XIV. Now, Machinists in Final Fantasy, I believe, have existed longer than that. I'm actually going to look it up really quickly here. Simply because... yeah, so Machinists have kind of existed in Final Fantasy for a little while. However, they weren't really a class, quote unquote. Like the first time they're really called Machinist is going to be depending on when you want to really call it an official class. In Final Fantasy Tactics, both Mustadio and Barich are Machinists. They list their class as Machinist. But they were unique characters, and all unique characters had their own special class. So that sometimes didn't really mean anything. Some of the abilities... and the idea of a gun-wielding character did show up in earlier games. Final Fantasy VI, Edgar was effectively a machinist. They had all these different weapons that they used that were really, really cool and fun. Inventions, things like the Bioblaster, the Bowcaster. I think that's what it was called. And in the Nintendo Player's Guide for Final Fantasy III, in the US, that's what Final Fantasy VI was originally released as, was Final Fantasy III, because we didn't get 2 and 3 on the NES. They listed his job as mechanic. But a lot of the abilities of the Final Fantasy XIV Machinist are based on kind of a combination of Mustadio and Edgar. And that's where they get them. And you had other kind of weapons-based characters, or gun-based characters in the game. You had, in Final Fantasy VII, you had Barrett had his gun arm. And then Vincent actually had various different guns that he would use. In Final Fantasy VIII, Laguna used a gun and kind of fit into that role. Though he didn't get other little gizmos and gadgets that's kind of built into the Machinist in Final Fantasy XIV. His limit break did involve him swinging through the air, shooting, and then throwing a bunch of grenades. So that kind of fits in there. And then in Final Fantasy XII, Balthier is technically kind of a Machinist. The outfits and things like that do heavily reflect Balthier as far as that. And he traditionally uses a gun, though Final Fantasy XII was weird in the idea that due to their license board system, in the original version, literally every character could use every single weapon, every single spell and every single kind of armor. You just had to buy the right licenses, and it was weird. When you get to the Zodiac Age re-release, which is brilliant, Machinist was actually one of the one of the jobs that you could choose. So yeah, again, compared to something like the Warrior, which has been around since the beginning, or the Paladin, which kind of showed up in 4 and had been hinted at in 3 and was kind of, an upgrade from the Knight class from the original Final Fantasy. The Machinist is a relatively new class. But it makes sense in the series, and again, I have a Machinist. I have them almost max level, and I have to remember to finish leveling them before Endwalker, just because due to the crunch and everything that's going to happen, I may lose a lot of experience if I don't. And I have them at I'm like 77 or something like that, so I'm real close to having them maxed. Anyway, the Machinist in Final Fantasy XIV is really fun, to be blunt. The Machinist was my first technically ranged physical, my first ranged DPS class. I had a red mage, but they're a casting class. It is a whole different thing. Machinists can do what's called kiting, which is a thing in MMOs in general where you will attack a creature at range and then just keep running away from them so that you never quite get into their attack range, but you can keep just taking pot shots at them. And the Machinist is actually kind of built using, I think it's a leg graze. You can slow them down and then just kite them around as you kill mobs and things like that. It means you have to be really aware of the aggro range of other mobs around, but you can kill quite a few creatures that you normally wouldn't be able to because you don't have to trade blows with them. You can just shoot them at a distance. And because of that, it's a super mobile class. Compared to most of the other classes that I've played, where you kind of just sit, you park it, you park your character down, do their attacks, and then avoid stuff, but you generally have to be very close. The Machinist, you didn't. And it was one of the things I loved about it, because I could be running all the way around the battlefield, going wherever I wanted, just destroying stuff. I actually used the Machinist to do grinding for my relic weapon, because at one point in the grind you have to run, what is it, it's 20, 40, I think it's 120 8-man raids. You have to go through 120 8-man raids for one step of the quest. Now the 8-man raids are just a single boss fight, so it's not as bad as it could be if it was something like an alliance raid, but oh boy was it not fun. And so I used Machinist for about half of them. It wasn't even 100 it wasn't 120, it was 36, it was 180, sorry. So for 120 of them I used my Machinist, and then the last ones I used I think I used my Monk, just because DPS queue faster for those. For some bizarre reason, I haven't quite figured out yet, but DPS queue really, really fast for those 8-man raids. So, anyway, so yeah, the Machinist itself is it's an interesting class. In Final Fantasy XIV, like I said, it's very mobile. You have quite a few different little tricks that you can do, and it's a very interactive class. You actually have 2 different off global cooldown shots that you get to fire, and you have this gauge, this heat gauge, that when it fills up, you can do this thing that allows you to just ignore the global cooldown entirely and just spam a couple different attacks. And so it's a lot of fun to play because you're always doing something, even more so than other classes. And from a very low level, you are always doing something. A lot of other classes, you don't start getting your off global cooldown stuff until you get to a pretty high level. And so low level stuff can be really, really boring. It's not that way with a Machinist. So let's see how the Machinist translates into D&D, shall we? So, first thing we're talking about is class features. This is just, the regular stuff. Things, hit points, proficiencies, equipment, stuff like that. So, hit points use a D8 for their damage die, which again, pretty standard. Generally, range-based classes are going to be D8s, and melee-based classes are going to be D10s. It's just how it is. So, it's a range class, it's a D8. Simple. Proficiencies are proficient in light armor, which again makes sense. The weapons they're proficient in are simple weapons, pistols, hunting rifles, revolvers, and muskets. Everything except for simple weapons, I believe, does not show up in the player's handbook. They may have either pistols or revolvers, but I believe in the Dungeon Master's Guide they actually have a little bit more on firearms and things like that. Now, if I remember correctly, in Xanathar's or Tasha's, they also expand firearms as well. I think it was in Tasha's because artificers actually traditionally were linked with firearms in general, especially in Eberron. They would use firearms and repeating crossbows is another thing that they'd use a lot in Eberron. So so if you don't know where to find those, again, I don't know if they actually have them, have all the stats you would need for them in here, but the combination of DMG and I believe Tasha should give you everything you need for those, okay? For tools, they get 2 sets of Artisan's tools. Saving throws, they get Dex and Intelligence. This is a MAD class, multi-attribute dependent. It'll need both Dexterity and Intelligence for different things. And then skills, choose 2 from Athletics, Arcana, History, Insight, Intimidation, Perception, and Survival. And then for the equipment that you start off with, you get to choose between leather or hide armor, a pistol and 20 bullets, or a dagger, a musket and 20 bullets, an explorer's pack or a dungeoneer's pack, a set of artisan's tools of your choosing, and an aether converter. I'm not 100% certain what the aether converter is because it doesn't really talk about it for the rest of the base class. If it shows up in the subclasses, or I might have just missed it while I was reading through. But I know in Final Fantasy XIV, the aether converter is what you use to power your inventions. Specifically, your Rook Auto Turret that turns into your robot buddy. So yeah, it's possible I just missed it, or it may be that it talks about it much more in the subclasses and I just haven't gotten to them yet. But yeah, so that's your class features. Again, pretty simple, makes sense. Nothing in it that I would change or anything other than maybe putting a note or something about what an aether converter is, because they talk about it, or they say you get an aether converter and then they don't mention it again. As far as I can tell. And just having a little note that say, by the way, this is what an aether converter is, would be nice. So, starting at first level, you get Suppressive Fire. When you use the ready action to prepare an attack to prepare to attack a target creature, you are able to disable your target temporarily. If your attack hits, the target creature must make a Constitution saving throw against your Machinist save DC. On a failed save, the creature is knocked prone and their speed becomes 0 feet until the end of their turn. Machinist save DC is 8 plus your Dex plus your proficiency bonus. So it's a Dex-based DC. They actually have 2 different DCs that they use in here. We'll talk about the other one in a little bit. And normally I would not be a huge fan about adding multiple DCs you have to get track of, but it just makes sense in this class, so I have no problem with it. So the interesting thing about this, being knocked prone is actually a very useful thing to do to enemies for a number of reasons. First things first, being knocked prone means melee attacks made against you have advantage. But it also means ranged attacks against you have disadvantage. So there is a little bit of push and pull there. But all your attacks while you are prone are made with disadvantage. And the interesting thing about Suppressive Fire that does make it very, very useful is In order to get out of the prone position, you have to use half of your movement unless you have a special feat. But even with a special feat, it costs 5 feet of movement. When your speed is 0, you can't leave prone. So, Suppressive Fire effectively means that you are knocking the target prone until bare minimum, not their next turn, but their turn after that. Because they can't get out of the prone position without any speed. So that alone is really, really useful. To the point where if it weren't for the fact that it requires a save, and at first level your saves are not, your Machinist save DC is not going to be an exceptional thing to deal with, this could become very broken very quickly. And the best way that you would want to use it would be targeting a creature that uses mostly melee attacks, or just makes attacks that use attack rolls. Because again, if you are prone, all of the attacks you make are made with disadvantage. So this forces them to go prone, which is going to be helpful for your allies, but it also means any attacks they're going to make are going to be made with disadvantage. And at first level, this is really, really useful. At 20th level, this is still really useful. Being able to impose disadvantage on all attack rolls for a creature, even if it only lasts a single round, is super, super useful. Now, when you get to 20th level, there are going to be creatures that are immune to the prone condition. And because this is technically two different things, they are knocked prone and their speed becomes 0. It would still mean that if they were immune to prone, their speed would still be reduced to 0, which is still useful. Like, Suppressive Fire is just an ability that's always going to be useful, which I think is interesting. Like I said, my only issue with it is it, as a level 1 ability, it could be a little bit overpowering, but due to the fact that it takes your action to ready an attack, and then it actually takes your reaction to use that attack. A lot of people don't realize if you ready an attack, you use your reaction to activate the attack, or if you ready a spell, you use your reaction. So Suppressive Fire takes 2 things. It takes 2 actions. It takes both your action and your reaction. Because this is a ranged-based class, you're probably not going to be using your reaction a ton. So it's a good trade-off. To be blunt, it's a really good trade-off, and I think it's really interesting. I will say, when I do final thoughts, this is this is going to be a defining feature. But Suppressive Fire throughout the rest of the class is never talked about again. So with that, it's not a defining feature, but it should be. And so the one change that I recommend for this, just to better fit with defining features, is change the name from Suppressive Fire to Reactive Graze. We will talk about Graze attacks later, because they show up later, but that will just allow you to link those together, because they do very similar things, and that will be able to kind of redefine this as a defining feature, which it should be. It's something unique to the class. Now, that being said, the suggestions I'm going to make are going to rely on the idea that the only thing we're changing about Suppressive Fire is its name. However, something that could be really, really cool, and again, I'll talk about a little more in final thoughts, is retooling the class to be a reaction-based class, where most of your attacks are happening using your reaction. It would require a lot more work. You'd have to retool just about everything about the class to make it work as a reaction, and things would have to be significantly more powerful, seen as readying an action takes your action, and then you're using your reaction to actually do it on another character's turn. Things would have to be a little bit more powerful to kind of justify the fact that you're using multiple things. But it could be really cool. So we'll talk about that in final thoughts. So that's level 1. Level 2, first thing you get is called Technical Support. You are able to use your artisan's tools to disarm mechanical traps. There's nothing to say about it. It's a cool, useful ability. You don't need thieves' tools to disarm traps. That's all it is. There's nothing wrong with it. It's cool. It's interesting. It fits the idea of a machinist. I have no problem with it. I think it's awesome. The other thing that you get at level 2 is called Sounding Sentry. You have developed a tiny device which casts the alarm spell. You can affix it to a door or a window, or have it monitor an area around itself in a 20-foot cube. You may use this device once before needing to charge it during a long rest. This is the other half of the Machinist. One half is going to be, I have a gun and I can shoot things. The other half is going to be, look at all the cool things I can make. My one suggestion for this is there's a third level ability called Technologist. I think we need to shift it down to second level and combine it with Sounding Sentry. Simply because Technologist, all it says is you may have developed technologies a long time, your Machinist archetype. Certain actions may require creatures to make saving throws or you to make attack rolls to hit. These are calculated as follows. Tech attack bonus is your intelligence modifier plus proficiency. Tech save DC is 8 plus intelligence plus proficiency. So basically, anything using your technology uses your intelligence. Anything using your gun uses your dexterity. That's where the MAD comes from, the multi-attribute dependent. And because all Technologist is telling you what you use to attack and what your save DC is for tech attacks, if we shift it to second level and combined it with Sounding Sentry, all it does is say, by the way, these are the saves, and we can turn Technologist in general into the second defining feature of this. Again, quick refresher on 5th edition class design. Every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, there are all these things called defining features. A defining feature is something that's either unique to the class or the class gets earlier than any other class or can use it in a different way than any other class. And in order for something to be a defining feature, it needs to show up in the first 2 levels. There really isn't any reason to leave Technologist at 3rd level, despite the fact that you don't have a use for a tech attack bonus or tech save DC at 2nd level. Simply moving it there and making Sounding Sentry like a subheading under it, like this is your first thing, doesn't change the class, doesn't really change how anything works, but it allows us to group the class much easier into defining features, which makes it easier for someone reading the class to understand how they're supposed to play it and how it's supposed to be different than others. The defining features serve 2 things. One, again, it makes every class play differently. 2, by grouping defining features together and referring back to defining features when you modify them or things like that, it helps create a roadmap for how the class is meant to be played, and it helps people to be able to understand the class better. So it's one of the reasons why I harp on naming and things like that, because if you name things correctly, it actually provides a roadmap for how the class is meant to be played, and it makes it easier for people to pick up. So that's why I'm making this huge emphasis of shift Technologist, basically turn Technologist, Sounding Sentry into Technologist, and then Sounding Sentry can just be a subheading under it. This is your first tech thing you developed, if that makes sense. So yeah. At 3rd level, you choose your archetype. We'll have a different video for each one of those. The 3 archetypes are Marksman, Tinkerer, and Grenadier. I will... I think you can kind of guess what each one will focus on. Marksman, I'm going to guess, uses the gun. Tinkerer, I'm going to guess, gets a lot more devices. And then Grenadier, I'm going to assume blows stuff up. So, yeah, we'll deal with those in other videos. 4th level, ability score improvement. We've talked about a billion times. Increase ability scores or take a feat. Next. 5th level, you get 2 things. Extra attack, which we already know makes perfect sense. You get to make 2 attacks instead of 1. And you get reload. Beginning at 5th level, ranged weapons you use lose their loading property. For those of you that don't know, the loading property is a feature that a lot of people don't understand and get confused with the ammunition property. The loading property states that even if you have extra attack, if an object has, or if a weapon has the loading property, you can only make one attack with it per turn. So it basically means crossbows are the ones that most people think of with the loading property. Because in the PHP, I think it's the only one that actually has the loading property. But it means if you're using a crossbow, even if you have extra attack, or if you're a fighter and you can do 3 or 4 attacks in a turn, if you're using a crossbow, you can only fire once. Because it's complicated firing it. You actually have to load something in and cock it. If you've ever seen a pump action crossbow, or a crossbow in general, the way that it works is you have the bow and then you have the handle. And the way that you load it is you take a bolt and there's a little thing in there that's going to set your trigger for it. And so you have to pull it back, and while you're pulling it back, you're also pulling the bowstring back on the crossbow. And as you pull it back, it'll eventually lock so that the crossbow bolt is in there and is locked in place, and you don't have to hold anything, unlike a bow where you're holding it, and it takes a huge toll on your biceps, and especially your triceps hurt really bad if you hold a bow too long. It really starts to hurt. So crossbow, you don't have to do that. Because of that, though, it's not like a bow where you can just go pow, pow, and that actually is something that is a firing style that people train in and did train in when bows were like really big in warfare. Was learning how to draw, knock, and fire in one fluid motion. You can't do that with a crossbow. That's why the loading property exists. And firearms have the loading property as well, because they require you to physically load, especially if you're talking about early firearms like muzzle loaders and things like that. Loading was a long process. Now, the ammunition property means that it requires ammunition. And if it is a one-handed weapon, it requires a free hand to load the ammunition in. That's another thing that people don't remember often, is the idea that even if you take crossbow expertise as a feat that a lot of people take, which removes the loading property from crossbows. So you can use a crossbow and you can fire it multiple times. It's really cool. But they tend to forget that the ammunition property still requires them to have a free hand to be able to load with. So anyway, so reload allows you to basically use your extra attack when you're using your firearms is basically what it is, which is good. The only change I would make to this is once you get extra attack, the usefulness of suppressive fire, which we have renamed reactive Graze, becomes less useful, because it's really nice to be able to knock a target prone and reduce its speed to as a 0, but you're losing a lot of damage doing that, because now using your action to ready an action is not just replacing one attack, it's replacing 2. So I do recommend one minor adjustment to reload, which is to add the phrase at the end: when using reactive Graze, you can target 2 creatures within 30 feet of each other and in range of your weapon instead of just one. So basically it allows you to use your extra attack on your reaction effectively. But it puts a few limitations on there just so it's not completely overpowered. They have to be within 30 feet of each other, things like that. So you're not just going like pow, pow, because that would be super broken. So yeah. Going up to 7th level, there is a typo on here. On the actual Machinist table, it says Peloton, which is the next ability, is at 7th level. But in the text, it says beginning at 6th level. So you just want to change that to beginning at 7th level. But anyway, at 7th level, you get Peloton. Your base movement speed is increased by 5 feet, and you may use your intelligence modifier for initiative rolls. This is a cool ability, however. Base move is increased by 5 feet is useful. You know, extra speed is always useful. But using your intelligence modifier instead of your dexterity modifier is not really going to make a massive difference for at least the base Machinist. Obviously, again, I would assume like the Tinkerer is probably going to be using their intelligence modifier a lot more than their dex, but being able to use your intelligence modifier isn't going to be a massive thing because you already have a decent dexterity modifier. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not quite as useful as it might be. And again, I haven't really gone through the subclasses. Normally, I go through everything and then I make my first video. I've been exhausted, so I've only gone through the base class thus far. But yeah, I would add just to make Peloton work a little bit more like it does in Final Fantasy 14. Final Fantasy 14 Peloton is a roll ability, so you actually share it with the Bard. And basically what it is, it's a movement speed buff that you can use outside of combat. Once you get in combat, it turns off. But it's really, really useful, especially when you're doing alliance raids and there's long periods that you have to go between fights where you're just walking. Yeah, I used to use it all the time in the Crystal Tower raids because I did them a lot because they're super fun. So the only thing I would change is I would add, as a bonus action, you can increase the speed of all allies within 10 feet of you by 5 feet for 1 minute. And that's just to better mimic the Peloton ability. And again, your base movement speed increased by 5 feet is nice. It's a pretty lackluster 7th level of ability. So just adding that a little bit extra thing where you can also increase your party speed by 5 feet for a minute just makes it actually worth something. Right now, 7th level feels really boring for the Machinist, and it shouldn't. So just adding that little bit to it will just make it more fun and more useful. Yeah. Going to 9th level, we have Eye for Design. When assessing mechanical systems and intentional designs, you gain advantage on investigation checks to understand how a mechanical system works, and advantage on survival checks to track a creature within a building, village, town, or city. This is role-playing stuff, and I like it. I think it's cool. I really, really like the idea of survival checks to track a creature within a building, village, town, or city. I think is interesting. Not for the mechanical benefit of it, because I could take it or leave it, but for the idea behind the mechanical benefit. The idea that machinists understand how things work. And by understanding how moving pieces fit together, not only do they understand actual machines, but cities work like machines. And buildings are built in, by engineers and things like that. So, the idea that they're understanding machines also gives them an understanding of, okay, well, if someone was trying to go through this massive city-shaped machine, they would probably go here, 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 here. I think it's interesting. Mechanically, it'll be useful in certain situations. So I have no problem with the ability. I think it's really cool. I think the lore aspects behind it are cooler than the actual mechanical aspects, but the mechanical aspects are cool too. So, one other thing I meant to mention at 7th level with Peloton. I guess we can do it now. At 10th level, you get Graze. is. Now, I mentioned before we were going to talk about Graze again because we changed Suppressive Fire into Reactive Graze. The reason we did that is so we can combine it with Graze, which I will explain right now. Using your bonus action, you can empower your next shot to target a limb, causing different effects. If your attack lands, your target must make a dexterity saving throw against your Machinist save DC or fall under the selected effect. This effect lasts until your next action where applicable. And then you can use this feature a number of times equal to your intelligence modifier. Minimum once you regain any expended uses when you finish a long rest. So Graze effects. They have 4 different effects. They have head, heart, arm, and leg. Leg knocks the target prone. Arm gives them the disarmed effect, which isn't a thing, and we'll talk about that in a second. Heart gives them the frightened condition, and head gives them the stunned condition. So Graze we're going to lump in with the first level ability Suppressive Fire, which has been changed to Reactive Graze, simply so that they can all be part of the defining features, which is basically you get to do trick shots effectively. And I don't think you should get all of them at the same time. I think arm and leg should show up at level 7 to coincide with Peloton, because again, Peloton still, even with a little bit more we added to it, still isn't the most amazing thing in the world. So also going, oh, by the way, you can now use arm graze and leg graze. And it just works better. At 10th level, we would add heart graze, and heart graze is the one that gives you frightened. And then going up to I think going up to 14th or 15th level. I haven't quite decided. I'll decide by the end of this video. We would add in head graze because it's the stun condition can be really, really overpowered. So waiting until I'm gonna say 15th level, just because it kind of fits with some other classes getting really useful abilities at 15th. So yeah, waiting until 15th level to get the stun condition, and again, it's also supposed to be a monk exclusive ability. So waiting until 15th level while monk get it at 5 makes sense. The other thing about this that I'm not particularly fond of is for this effect lasts until your next action where applicable. Your next action is not defined in 5th edition. So this becomes really, really muddy to say the least. Some people would say your move action is an action. Your bonus action. So if you use a bonus action in your next turn, does it do it? Like it's not really defined. So I would say it should be until either the start or the end of your next turn, just to make it kind of work differently than other class abilities, to make it a little more unique. I would say to the start of your next turn is when this stuff would happen. Yeah, so those would be the 2 things that I would change for it. All right. So, yeah, just it ends at starting next turn. I mentioned before, disarmed isn't a condition in 5th edition. And the ability to disarm opponents is something that is extremely limited in 5e D&D. In the PHB, there is no way to disarm aside from a Battle Master maneuver. So taking that away from the Battle Master can make it feel a little bit less special. In the DMG, they added some alternate rules for trying to disarm an opponent, and to be blunt, they don't really work that well. And they revisited them, I think maybe in Xanathar's. But the idea of disarming a creature doesn't mean anything in 5th edition. The reason is you can interact with an object for free on your turn, and one of the interactions you can make is picking up a weapon that's on the ground, or dropping a weapon. Both of those would count as your one free object interaction. So if you disarm a creature, when their turn comes around, they can just pick up their weapon and attack. Not holding a weapon doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't put you at any sort of disadvantage. The only thing that would change is if you disarm them and took off their shield, their armor class would lower. But as soon as their turn comes up, they can just pick it up and go again. That's one of the reasons why for the Battle Master maneuver, not only do you disarm him, but you can drop the weapon further away. And that actually makes it useful. So for arm shots, for the disarmed condition to be useful at all, it needs to have more explanation than just disarmed. Because disarmed doesn't mean anything in 5th edition. It's not a condition. And if you take it to mean they drop their weapon, that has no impact on gameplay. It sounds like it should, and if you get really clever, some people have claimed that, well, you can make them drop it, and then you can use your free object interaction to pick it up, and then they can't have the weapon. But then you're also going to come into issues with the idea that, well, it drops in their space and you can't enter an enemy's space, so you wouldn't be able to pick it up anyways because it's in their space and it's not in your space. So overall, there needs to be some kind of definition of what disarmed is built into when it shows up, which again, I think it should show up at level 7 instead of at 10. And at 10th level, you can get the heart Graze. And then I think what would be best is allowing you to disarm them and knock the weapon. I think 10 feet away would make the most sense. Because if you knock it 10 feet away, in order to get to it, they have to move close enough to it, which could provoke an opportunity attack or a bunch of other things. So at that point, it would actually be useful. Simply making them drop it, as far as how action economy works in 5th edition, has no effect on the game other than if it's a shield. That is the only time it does anything. Otherwise, it literally doesn't change the game whatsoever, and it is a wasted action. So, yeah. Moving up to 13th level, you get Combat Roll. When you are targeted by an attack, you may use your reaction to impose disadvantage on the attack and move up to 5 feet to an open space without provoking an attack of opportunity. You can use this feature a number of times equal to your Dex mod. You gain any expended uses when you finish a long rest. This is a cool ability. You get to impose disadvantage. Useful right there. Second, you get to move 5 feet. Also useful. Without provoking opportunity attacks. Also useful. If you time it correctly, if you have a creature that comes up, especially if it has multi-attack, comes up to you, but it has to use all of its movement to get there because you are a ranged character, so you're running around, you can effectively use Combat Roll as a way to kind of kite. So they come up, they take a swing at you. They don't have to hit you, they just have to make an attack. You impose disadvantage on the attack, so they may or may not miss you, but you also move 5 feet. Now, you're not within reach anymore. They either have to move again, or if they're out of movement, they have to waste their attacks, either by attacking someone else or just not finishing, because there's no one in range that they can attack. It can be really, really useful. It does require you to understand how far your enemies can move, and be very aware of layout on on the battlefield, so that you know where you want to go. Again, even if they haven't used all their movement, if you're standing next to someone and or near enough to someone, and you move to the point where if this creature was to follow you, to be able to make another attack against you, it would provoke an opportunity attack from another player. That would be another way you can use combat roll. Now, because it requires your reaction to do, it does mean you can choose to use combat roll, or if you were using reactive Graze, which used to be Suppressive Fire, that means you probably won't want to use combat roll because you will be wasting your ready to attack to use combat roll. So it does give you a little bit of a choice of, okay, am I using reactive Graze already? Am I using combat roll? It also could be when you notice someone coming for you, you could reactive Graze and shoot them and stop them in their traps before they could even get to you. So a lot of choices, a lot of interesting things. I like it. I think it's cool. Again, I'm not particularly fond of tying it to the Dex mod because by 13th level, you're going to have a 20 Dex mod. So you can just say you can use it 5 times. There's no reason to link it to the Dex mod. But this one at least makes kind of sense because it is you dodging. So linking it to your Dex mod does kind of make sense. So going to 14th level, you have Ricochet. You may spend your reaction to perform a ricochet shot if you are attacking with a firearm. Upon landing a successful attack, you make a second attack against a creature within 5 feet of the first target creature. Second attack does not consume ammunition. So this is another reaction-based ability. Because one of the defining features of the class uses your reaction, you are kind of choosing between using your reaction for combat roll, using your reaction for ricochet, or using your reaction for reactive Graze. Ricochet is just never really going to be that useful because it requires you to have 2 enemies literally right next to each other. And especially by 14th level, enemies have learned not to stand in what we call fireball formation, which is everybody stand as close as they can to each other. So Ricochet is going to be super, super, super situational. And combat roll and reactive Graze are always going to be better uses of your reaction than Ricochet is. So I propose just changing Ricochet. Ricochet itself is an ability in Final Fantasy XIV. It's one of the off global cooldown abilities you get. You get Ricochet, and I can't remember what the other one is. I'll be able to tell you in a second here because I have the class opened up. So Gauss Round, that's the other one, is Gauss Round. So between Gauss Round and Ricochet, you actually have 2 off global cooldown shots you can do between your combos. The way Ricochet works is Gauss Round hits a single enemy, Ricochet actually hits everyone in a little area. And I kind of prefer the Ricochet in this to work that way. So I think you should change the text of a Ricochet to, beginning at 14th level, when you hit an enemy using your reactive Graze feature, you can cause the bullet to fragment, causing all creatures within 5 feet of the target to make a dexterity saving throw against your Machinist DC. On a failure, they take damage equal to your dexterity modifier. You can use this ability a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, regaining all uses after a long rest. So first things first, I just made a big fuzz about tying things to your dex mod, and then I just said tie something to your dex mod. The reason I'm saying that is on your ranged attacks, you roll your weapon damage die, and then you add your dexterity mod. Basically, this is just letting you add your dexterity, use that dexterity mod damage on everyone. So that's all it is, and I could have phrased it that way, but it's wordier and more confusing. So if I just say, damage equal to your dexterity modifier, it's a smaller phrase that means the exact same thing. They take the additional damage the target would take from you being accurate. So, again, I like tying things to proficiency bonus over dexterity, just because, first of all, you get to use it more often once you get to level 17, and it continues to get better, whereas ability modifiers, generally by level 8, if it's important to your class, you have it maxed. So, Yeah, I just think to make it better fit with how Ricochet works and to actually make it useful, because right now it's not. Again, you're very rarely going to have a time when you're going to have two enemies right next to each other that it's worth doing this. And again, you have to use your reaction, which reaction is a reaction to something else. Even when you ready an action, you are reacting to something that the enemy does. You can't react to yourself because you already know it's going to happen. So I'm not a big fan of reacting to your own abilities because it's not something you can react to. You can plan to do something after, but you can't react because you're not getting any new information that you're reacting to. Whereas anything else, you're reacting to a trigger of something else on the battlefield. So, yeah. If it's going to be a reaction, it needs to react to something else. So, going to 15th level, you get Emergency Rescue. You've developed a life-saving device which casts Cure Wounds on a creature with 0 hit points on contact. And Intelligence is your spellcasting ability for this device. As an action, you can throw the palm-sized spherical device at a creature within 20 feet of you. If you have 0 hit points at the start of your turn and the device is in your possession, it will automatically activate and heal you as a free action. The device can cast Cure Wounds once. The device is recharged when you finish a short rest. This is super cool. I've mentioned before, healing in 5th edition is a little bit underpowered because generally the best way to use healing is on creatures with 0 hit points. For Emergency Rescue, you literally do that. It takes your action to do it, which I'm perfectly fine with. Getting someone back up for being unconscious should take an action. However, the other thing that's really cool about it is if you just have it on you, this is a get out of death free card. And the interesting thing about it is it only activates at the start of your turn, not when you hit 0 hit points. The reason that's a big deal is a lot of DMs will kind of have this unwritten rule where when a character goes unconscious, unless it is a really evil bad guy, if a creature has multiple attacks, once a creature goes unconscious, generally the threat is no longer active from that target, so it doesn't make sense for most creatures to continue attacking an unconscious target, and you will redirect. The reason that's such a big deal is if you're unconscious, an attack roll within 5 feet, because when you're unconscious at 0 hit points, you're also incapacitated. When you're incapacitated, melee attacks made within 5 feet are auto crits if they hit. And if you get hit with a critical hit, while you're making death saves, it counts as 2 failed death saves. So a creature with 3 attacks, which by 15th level is almost a given. A creature with 3 attacks and you're low on hit points, if it knocked you out on the first attack, if it used its other 2 attacks against you, which have advantage because you're prone and on the ground, it would instantly kill you, and there would be nothing any of your allies or anything could do about that. So again, it's generally an unwritten rule for a lot of DMs that unless the creature has a reason to want to attack an unconscious body, like they're sentient and they realize that killing you is a better move than using attacks on someone that has full hit points or something like that, or they're an evil kind of creature and want to inflict suffering on the party, so they try and actually murder you as opposed to taking you out of the fight. It'll mean that the creature goes and attacks something else. If this thing activated as soon as you hit 0 hit points, it would keep attacking you, and it would kind of be useless. However, with it waiting until your turn, it means it's only going to be used when it's the most useful for you, which is on your turn before you have to make a death save or anything like that. Boop. It activates, you are conscious, you get your full turn, because it happens at the beginning of your turn, and you get to do stuff. So overall, I really like Emergency Rescue. I think it's a cool ability. It fits into the kind of theme of the machinists kind of building their own stuff. I like it. I think it's cool. Moving on to 18th level, you get Cloaking Device. You've developed a cane-sized device which turns you and all creatures within a 5-foot radius of you invisible for 1 minute. All creatures must remain within 5 feet of the device to retain invisibility. You can use the cane once before you need to recharge it during a long rest. So, invisibility. Invisibility is always useful. I believe monks actually get the ability at the same level to turn invisible. They can only turn themselves invisible, but they also gain resistance to almost all damage while they're invisible. This one doesn't do that, but it can actually cloak multiple people. There's nothing in this that says that attacking renders it inoperative or anything like that. So you can turn yourself invisible and attack and do all the things that you want to without having to worry about anything. And other people, as long as they stay close to you, can get invisible as well. It can also mean if you have kind of intelligent enemies, if somebody runs and then turns invisible randomly, they'll know where you are because you're at the center of where the invisibility starts. So that's the one kind of downside of it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that could make for a really interesting battle where the enemy just keeps running and waiting until they turn invisible, and then they know roughly where you are and they can attack you. So yeah. Otherwise, yeah, it's a cool ability. There's nothing else about other than it's a cool ability. Going to 20th level, you get Midas Touch. As a bonus action, you can complete maintenance on an invention in an instant. You must then finish a long rest to use Midas Touch again. The only problem I have with Midas Touch is complete maintenance is undefined. I don't know what that means. Nothing in the class thus far has mentioned anything needing maintenance. So it needs to be defined. If it means what I think it means, which is effectively you can recharge one of your inventions for free at 20th level, I think that's great. I think it's a good ability. But it needs to be defined. Specifically, when it's first introduced, you need to define what does maintenance mean. There is a little appendix right there. It says the cost of firearms and to rebuild lost, destroyed, or stolen accessory equipment granted by features can be found in the Machinist Appendix D on page 106. So it does mention, it'll tell you how much it costs, but it doesn't tell you what complete maintenance does. So that's the only issue I have with Midas Touch is tell me what complete maintenance means. And if it means you get to use one of your tech items, you can recharge it for free, say that. I think that's a cool 20th level of ability. It fits with the class really well, and yeah. So, final thoughts. Overall, I like the class. I think it's cool. I think it needs some adjustment so that it fits within the idea of defining features to make it a little easier to play. The other thing I mentioned, I was going to talk about in final thoughts, was the idea that if we took Suppressive Fire and made that the defining feature, where the defining feature is this class acts using reactions and effectively acts on other people's turns, this could turn into a really, really interesting, unique class. There isn't a single class or subclass or anything that acts entirely using reactions on other people's turns. It would take a full rework of the class to do that. All of the abilities would have to be built in with the idea that you would be using your reaction most times to ready an action. And then, yeah, but I just think it would be really, really cool to have a class that makes its attacks or does its big things on other people's turns. I think that's really, really cool. I think it'd be really, really interesting. Like I said, the one big downside of that is it would require a complete rework of this class. Overall, the class as written, I have no problems with it. I think it's a cool class. I think it could be a lot of fun. There is a... Matt Mercer came up with a gunslinger subclass for the fighter for the first season of campaign of Critical Role that it's kind of been accepted as just being a class to the point where I think it might actually. I'm going to. I don't think it is because it shows up in the wrong book. I'm going to check just to be on the safe side. Go to fighter. No, Gunslinger is officially on D&D Beyond. It does say this is unofficial material because it's Critical Role content, but it is on D&D Beyond. It is officially published by Wizards of the Coast. So Gunslinger kind of fits the defining features of this already, where the Grazes that we talk about are almost identical to the trick shots that that the Gunslinger gets. And that's generally what you see for most kind of Gunslinger gun-based classes that are homebrewed for 5th edition and in earlier editions, is they would get these trick shot abilities and they would let you kind of add conditions to your attacks. And that's what this one does. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. The Gunslinger is a fun subclass to play of the fighter, and it fits with the idea of the fighter very well. This is a different kind of class where it doesn't rely on the fighter getting a bunch of extra attacks in order to work, and the Gunslinger does. So this is kind of a different interpretation of the same thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think this is a perfectly, even without my suggestions, I think the class works relatively well. I think my suggestions make it work better, and make it fit into 5th edition class design better. But overall, I think the class is cool, and I think it's fun, and I would allow it at my table. However, if it were redesigned to be a reaction-based class, it would be so interesting. Again, it's something that doesn't exist in 5th edition, and it would require a lot of work to do it. That's why I'm not trying to redesign the class for that. The notes I'm not taking specific notes about how to do that, because that would be a ton of work. But if you were willing to put the work in for it, this would be the most unique class in the game. It would be massively fun. It would not only play differently than any other class, it would play differently than any other character on the board, because all of your big actions, the things that you would do, would happen on other players' turns. And by choosing when to have them activate, you could do so many cool, interesting things. And the subclasses could kind of point it a little bit more towards, okay, this one is going to be a little bit more about antagonizing the enemy, and this one is going to be a little bit more about helping your allies, and, things like that. Like, it could be a really interesting, awesome class. It just would take a lot of work, and it would literally be designing a new system. But the system would be built on something that already exists, which is using your reaction and using the ready action to effectively take your action on someone else's turn. So the core concepts of it, all concepts already exist in 5th edition, but you have to learn to use them in a different way. I think it'd be really cool, really interesting. And yeah, like I said, I am excited about the idea of that. And if I ever get the time, I might try building a class around that, because I just think it's really cool. I actually would almost want to go more of a monk route for it and turn it into a... I've always wanted a monk subclass, which is entirely built around using your reaction to make your attacks and having people attack you. Just because I like the idea of a defensive fighting style that is entirely built on reacting to your opponent, kind of like a Wing Chun style thing where your attacks are, redirecting their attacks and attacking at the same time, or blocking and attacking at the same time. Things like that, I think that'd be really cool. But this could do it, and it would be really, really awesome. Anyway, that is going to be all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, turn notifications on in the comments down below. Let me know First of all, do you like the minor tweaks I've suggested? Like I said, I think those would work and just make the class flow a little better. However, I also want to know in the comments below, what do you think about a reaction-based class? Do you think that would be as cool as I think that would be? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, and feel free, if you have ideas for reaction-based abilities that could be a part of this new reaction-based class, put them in the comments. Feel free to give whomever wants to take the daunting task of building a reaction-based class, give them fuel in the comments. Some of it may work, some of it won't, but just put it out there and they can pick and choose things that they think would fit with their idea. Again, I think it'd be super cool. Anyway, again, that's all for me today, and I will see you guys next time, all right? Bye-bye.